The Italian Navy in the 1940s is a topic that doesn't get much coverage. If you ask someone about it, you'll probably be told about a certain aircraft carrier raid. Or perhaps the Battle of Cape Matapan, where 3/4 of the Zara-class cruisers went down in one night. This video will not cover either of those events. This video will look at the one survivor of the Zara-class, the Italian cruiser Gorizia, the third member of the class, and the only one to escape damage that fateful night. Gorizia would continue on alone as the Italian Navy continued on, until ultimately suffering her own crippling damage. Unlike her sister ships, however, this cruiser would remain afloat until the end of the war. That was a success in its own right, I suppose. Regardless, let's begin this look at the Lucky Zara-class cruiser by covering the design of those ships. The final full class of Italian cruisers to be completed, with Bolzano a one-off, these are generally underrated ships. The aforementioned 3/4 of the class sunk in one night tends to lead to dismissing them as a whole, which is a shame because while treaty busting, they were quite capable ships, well protected, well armed, and decently fast, very well balanced, ignoring the displacement issue. Displacing 11,900 tons at standard load and 14,560 tons at full load, Gorizia was admittedly overweight, in the context of the 10,000-ton Washington Treaty limit. This displacement did allow for heavy armor, which was the main culprit in their weight issues. In fact, these ships were some of the best protected heavy cruisers ever built. The main armor belt, covering the machinery and magazines, was 150 millimeters, 5.9 inches at its thickest. Even at its thinner ends, this still maintained a thickness of 100 millimeters, or 3.9 inches, beneath the waterline. The deck armor wasn't quite as impressive, at 70 millimeters, or 2.8 inches, with a 20 millimeter plate to, hopefully, set off fuses. As for the weaponry, this was more standard for a European heavy cruiser, consisting of 8 203mm 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. These were carried in the classic 2 super firing on the bow, 2 super firing on the stern layout. A surprisingly heavy secondary battery of 16 100mm dual-purpose guns supported the main battery. These were carried in 8 twin mounts spread around the ship. Lighter defense came from 4 40mm guns in single mounts and 8 13.2mm machine guns in twin mounts. All of this armor and firepower was pushed through the water at 32 knots by 95,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. This was a compromise to try and get the weight down compared to a more standard 4-shaft layout. It helped, but again, the ships remained above the treaty limit. Regardless, that covers the design details. Let's move on to Gorizia's actual service career. That story began on March 17, 1930, in Livorno. On that day, the ship that would become Gorizia was laid down by the auto company. Construction would progress quite quickly by Italian standards, with the ship launched on December 28th of 1930, and then commissioned a little over a year later on December 31st, 1931. Her early service career was about as calm as you could expect after that. For the first half of the 1930s, Gorizia spent her time training and participating in various naval reviews. Italy was at peace at the time, and there was little need for the cruiser, other than showing her off to the King and Mussolini in any case. This quiet time would only come to an end in 1936, with the onset of the Spanish Civil War. The Italians were, as could be expected, major supporters of the nationalist cause in that conflict. Gorizia would mark her own participation in it by evacuating Italians from Spain. That came on July 31st, 1936, with the cruiser leaving Spain the very next day. She wouldn't return to Italy right away, however. Instead, after dropping her passengers off in France, Gorizia set sail for Germany. First for another naval review, albeit a multinational one this time, on August 8th. That was in Kiel. Then the cruiser stuck around to show the flag during the 1936 Olympics. Evidently, the sailing events for that competition were held in Kiel. Her excitement in 1936 also didn't come to an end with the Olympics. On the return voyage home, on August 24th, Gorizia's forward aviation gas tank exploded. Accidental detonations aboard ship are more common than you might expect, but never a good thing. The cruiser had just left port and had to turn right back around for repairs. The damage was judged severe enough that Gorizia had to detour to Gibraltar for temporary repair work. While in dry dock there, British officials examined the vessel. It was apparent to them that the Italian ship was heavier than the treaty allowed. However, Britain made no complaint about this that I've seen. Gorizia was just patched up enough to return to Italy, and that was that. The cruiser returned home, docking in La Spezia for permanent repair work. By November of 1936, she was back in the water and ship shape. The remainder of the 1930s was a return to quieter times, for the most part. More fleet reviews and more training. It was only in 1939 that things changed again. Once more because of Spain, at least at first. Gorizia and her sisters sortied to block a group of Spanish Republican ships from reaching the Black Sea on March 7th. Presumably running to the Soviet Union, the closest ideological ally of the Republican forces. The Italians wanted to force the ships to dock in Sicily, where they could be interned, and, one assumes, turned over to Franco. Instead, the formation, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, chose French Tunisia for their internment. The Italians had been ordered to not open fire, so there was little they could do to force the issue. The next bit of excitement was a month later, on April 7th, 1939. From the 7th to the 9th, Gorizia supported the Italian invasion of Albania. This saw no action, as the Albanians had no way to fight back to any real extent. As for the rest of the year, and into early 1940, there was nothing to really write home about. That would, of course, change by the middle of the year. Because on June 10th, 1940, Italy entered the Second World War. This would turn out to be a very poor decision, but that wasn't apparent at the time. France was on its last legs, and Britain was pushed out of the European continent. The Royal Navy, however, was still a very real concern, and the Regia Marina had been built with an eye towards fighting France, not the British. Nonetheless, Gorizia and her sisters set about their wartime duties. The first of which was patrolling off Crete, where Gorizia and her division were attacked by a submarine. The cruiser and her escorting destroyers responded in kind, but in the end, nothing came of this. The submarine hit nothing, and was apparently able to avoid any damage in turn. After that, Gorizia sailed back to Italian waters. There she would participate in the Battle of Calabria, the first major sea battle of the Mediterranean War. This was certainly exciting, but not for the cruiser. Gorizia was initially left out of the battle on July 9, 1940, on the wrong side of the Italian fleet. HMS Eagle did launch an air attack on this side of the formation, but this came to nothing. Gorizia and her fellow cruisers, mistaken for battleships, dodged the Swordfish and their torpedoes. Later on in the battle, Gorizia joined the other Italian cruisers in engaging their British counterparts. This would see damage to HMS Neptune, as well as Bolzano, but Gorizia escaped undamaged. Unfortunately for her crew, they similarly failed to damage the British. That was Calabria in a nutshell, however. A largely inconclusive engagement, other than the damage to the battleship Giulio Cesare. After the conclusion of the battle, Gorizia spent the next few months on training and convoy escort duty. On August 31st, there was a break in an attempt to intercept British convoys supplying Malta. This came to nothing, as did further hunting attempts in early September. In November, however, the British would come to the Italians. The attack on Taranto occurring on the night of November 11th, 1940. Gorizia was in the harbor during this attack, but she was one of the lucky ships to evade any damage. In fact, she shot down one of the British attackers. The cruiser's next major action came soon after, on November 27th, the Battle of Cape Spartivento, which would, in the end, turn out to be another inconclusive battle. Gorizia joined other Italian cruisers in a reprise of Calabria, engaging the British cruisers while fending off air attack. Once again, there was no real damage done to either side. Gorizia only managed to down another British aircraft, while her main guns failed to do much of anything. Mind you, not for lack of trying. However, with no real damage on either side, the battle drew to a close. Gorizia returned to Italy, where she remained into 1941. In fact, after training exercises in January, the cruiser went in for a routine refit on February 28, 1941. That refit lasted until May 7th, and it was because of that refit that she missed the Battle of Cape Matapan in late March. That battle saw all three of her sister ships, Zara, Fiume, and Pola, sunk on the night of March 29, 1941. Gorizia outlived her entire class by virtue of just happening to be in a refit. While you can call that lucky, I doubt her crew would agree. It's easy to imagine that most of them had friends aboard the other cruisers, and they were completely powerless in that moment. No matter how the crew felt, Gorizia returned to service on May 8, 1941. With the other Zaras on the bottom, the cruiser was reassigned to the 3rd Division with the 2 Trento-class cruisers. A mismatched formation, to be sure, but all Italy had left for heavy cruisers were these 3 ships and Bolzano. Herself a one-off, even if she was based on Trento. The rest of 1941, in the aftermath of that disastrous engagement, passed largely without incident. Gorizia, with her new squadron mates, mostly focused on escorting convoys between Italy and North Africa. This was quiet duty, broken only by attempts to either engage the British or flee from them. The only real exceptions to this, in Gorizia's case, were an air attack and a small battle late in the year. The air attack came on November 21st and saw splinter damage to the cruiser's superstructure. Just like her other encounters with British aircraft, though, Gorizia escaped mostly intact. The damage was judged so minor, in fact, that she sortied that same day to escort a convoy. As for the battle, well, that was the first Battle of Sirte on December 17th, which was somehow even more inconclusive than the other battles Gorizia participated in. Neither British nor Italian admirals were really interested in a fight, and all the combat happened at extreme range, with the result that neither side suffered any damage of note. As we move into 1942, not much changed for the Italian cruiser. She spent January in port before returning to combat in mid-February. Gorizia's first encounter with the British in 1942 was yet another air attack. This was in late February and also saw a submarine attack. The cruiser, as she had done before, evaded any damage. You could say that Gorizia was leading a charmed life, at least to this point, and you wouldn't be wrong. This would continue for the rest of 1942. Not that she didn't see action, because she certainly did, but the cruiser avoided damage. For example, at the Second Battle of Sirte on March 22nd, Gorizia emerged undamaged, although her guns once more failed to hit the British in turn, despite firing 226 rounds from her main battery. This, coupled with the First Battle of Sirte, left the cruiser with very worn-out barrels. a common issue with high-velocity Italian guns. Gorizia, as a result, returned to Messina to have her guns relined. While there, she was subjected to air attack on May 25th and 26th. However, her luck held out. The cruiser only had to deal with minor splinter damage. Other than further air attacks in early June, nothing of major note happened until June 15th. Gorizia, during an attempt to engage a Malta convoy, Operation Vigorous, evaded torpedo bomber attack. This she did well enough, but Trento was not as lucky. That cruiser was hit by a torpedo and sunk by a British submarine later on. You know, Gorizia is starting to sound like Prince Eugen. All the luck, while the ships around her suffered. In any event, the cruiser would evade another attack by submarine on August 11th. Bolzano, much as Trento had been, was not as fortunate. This attack is what ultimately put that cruiser out of the war. Gorizia's own luck would run out in 1943. After a quiet time in the remainder of 1942, the cruiser was forced north by continued Allied air attacks. It was these attacks that knocked Gorizia out of the war. On April 10, 1943, Gorizia and Trieste were attacked in port in Sardinia. Trieste was sunk outright. Gorizia was hit by 3 bombs. One detonated inside her aft superfiring turret, and the other 2 penetrated her port side next to her superstructure, coupled with several near misses breaching her hull, and the cruiser was lucky to remain afloat. Her crew kept the ship from flooding and sailed her off to La Spezia for proper repair work. The cruiser would still be there in dry dock when the Italian armistice was signed in September of 1943. The ship's captain was planning on scuttling the cruiser and flooding the dry dock. However, he gave up on that plan when it became apparent the Germans would get no use out of Gorizia. And, indeed, the Germans simply towed her out of the dry dock and left the cruiser in the harbor, where she would eventually be left a crippled wreck by Chariot man torpedo attack on June 21st, 1944. Gorizia remained where she was hit, afloat but with a terrible list, until April of 1945. The Allies liberated La Spezia at that point and turned Gorizia back over to the Italians. Unfortunately, the damage from both battle and decay was deemed too severe. The cruiser was scrapped in 1947 instead of being repaired and returned to service. An unfortunate end, to be sure. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.